evening if you are in Europe, or good night if you are in Asia or in the east side of the world. Good morning or good afternoon if you are on the west side. And today we're actually going to talk about what is happening in Europe, around Europe, and I would say also what are the reaction in the west side or the east side, or we figure out that actually the distinction west and east is changing dramatically. Last time we met, and we were actually talking about nutrition and nutrition labeling. And while we were talking about that, an invasion of Ukraine was happening with all the disasters that we are unfortunately experiencing. And I have to say, luckily enough, we are in that part of the Western world, in the Europe, where we are not receiving bombs on our head. But we have our guest, Nataliya, that I will present very shortly, that is from Ukraine and is definitely suffering the situation as the many victims that are right now fleeing from Ukraine and countries in Europe, including the one I'm here in. This is the Austrian Economics Monthly, our monthly meeting, the joint venture of the Austrian Economic Center and Competere. And as usual, I'm Pietro Paganini. Today, I have the role again of moderating and introducing you immediately to our speakers, our great speakers. And we will start with, obviously, our princess, as I call her, from the Austrian Economics, Barbara Kolm. And then we have Nataliya Melnyk, and we have Mikhail of Liechtenstein. As usual, and you know my style is not to read the full biography. Why? Because I want you, if you don't know them already, to go on the Austrian Economics Center website and read all the bios of the speakers that have been part of the Austrian Economics Monthly. And we've been going on for a while. As you know, we even have our banners behind here. But now, let's go to the topic of today. What's happening in the West? Our liberal democracy falling apart? What's happening in terms of geopolitics? And, you know, we have sanctions going on against Russia, but again, we have to take account that there are many countries around the world that are condemning the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, but at the same time, they are not applying sanctions and they're keeping buying commodities, particularly from Russia. And actually, Russia is flying today to India to sell their oil and their grains at a lower price. So there are countries that are saying, okay, what you're doing, it's fine as long as we can do business. So it seems we're back 30, 40 years during the Cold War, having two words. But if we look at the picture, it's not exactly that. Unfortunately, and I like to stress this, in the middle, there is a terrible war with a lot of victims. And I like to stress, these victims are in the side of the Ukrainian people, but unfortunately, as well, among a lot of people, the soldiers of Russia that probably are victims of a terrible regime. And we have to say that, again, talking about geopolitics, we're all condemning Putin, but in the past 20 years, many people, many also in the free market family, have been, you know, acknowledging some good things of the Putin regime. And that's something that we should keep in mind. But that's it for me. I would like to start with Barbara. Barbara, here you are. Tell us what's happening geopolitically. We're no longer talking about politics, but geopolitics. Are the liberal democracy falling apart? And is the Western world melting in front of the disaster? Or as somebody says, uniting to fight against the tyranny in Russia?
Well, thank you very much, Pietro, for the introduction, and thank you for hosting us again. As usual, I come up with numbers and figures, and because this is probably the way we can understand those tragic things that are going on in Ukraine these days. And I would simply start out with the GDP, the real GDP and inflation. Prior to the war, the outlook was pretty good for Europe and also the world. The recovery after COVID had picked up growth rates between 3 to 4% in Europe, where, you know, planned and we thought that would be possible. But now, immediately after the war had started, growth rates and went down, and inflation shot up as well. Not that we didn't have inflation before, and I have to stress that we already were talking about inflation in fall of last year. Actually, at the beginning of summer, we already realized that inflation would be coming because of the rise of energy prices and the new Green Deal, where many things had not been priced in already. But now, with the war in Ukraine, things are speeding up, and the real GDP, the outlook for March is like 3.2%. For 2023, it will be by 2.8%, and we are going down by 2024 to 1.6%. Inflation rates for 2022 right now are by 5.1%, but there are scenarios which are adverse, where we are a little bit higher, almost close to 6%. And if you have a severe scenario, those the inflation will go up to 7% plus, depending exactly where you are. There are parts in Europe, in the Eurozone, namely the Baltics, for example, where we already have two-digit inflation rates. And we in Western Europe, we're a little bit lower still, but it is something where we should set us thinking. Having said that, a war, when supply chains are being cut and totally, then it will definitely have more shocks available for the economy. And we have the downward risks that will be going on. So we have nothing else but extreme uncertainty, and the downward risks are the ones that are overweighing. So I would simply go to some data with regards to Ukraine and what ECB has done since the invasion of Ukraine and the war in Europe. So first of all, the idea was to provide liquidity to the entire banking system in Europe, and of course to Ukraine as well, and to support and help provide. Then the idea was not, the solution was not to have market disruptions in the financial market, and then of course to provide liquidity. So these are the tasks of the ECB. What have we seen as economic consequences of the war, Russia versus in Ukraine? So we have to look at the Russian economic importance for the EU. Russia is relevant to the EU primarily as a supplier of energy and other raw materials. At the same time, Russia is heavily dependent on raw material exports. Commodity prices continue to be driven up. Impact on global inflation, of course, dynamics. So we have to keep that in mind. Exports to Russia, less important for the EU, and some countries with significant bank exposure to Russia. So those countries are Italy, France, also Austria. There is some exposure there. On the other side, we see the economically relevant sanctions that the EU, the G7, have posted against Russia. And those include those financial sanctions. So approximately 50% of central bank reserves are frozen. The SWIFT exclusion, we have already discussed that and at another opportunity. Export restrictions on high-tech products, whether it's software or semiconductors, and US import ban on oil, gas, coal from Russia. Consequences for Russian economy are substantial, but there is remaining room for maneuvering due to the oil and gas export revenues. And we've seen, especially in Austria, that of course we depend on Russian oil and gas. So again, the time shift, the time lag that our industry needs to pick up in order to be able to produce and to function is important. There is other things with regards to the sanctions that they have entailed considerable negative effects on the Russian financial market, on the capital controls, on effects also via confidence effects. Solvency is an issue, but schemes for servicing FX foreign debt is being introduced, and also the short to medium term and negative real economic implications are there, but there is no permanent collapse. So in the long term, Russia will become more self-sufficient on the one hand, will fall behind technologically, most likely, and of course will lose competitiveness. So these are the things that are in the room, the black bird in the room. So, but let me talk a little bit and then I will stop. The international financial institutions, what they have put on the table to support and help Ukraine. So right now, Ukraine receives 1.2 billion of emergency financial assistance in long-term loans from the EU. As I already mentioned, the sanctions package. Then EBRD is providing reserves in the amount of 2 billion euros for emergency financial assistance, which means loans, liquidity assistance, and trade finance. The board of EBRD proposed indefinite suspension of access of Russia and Belarus to financing and funding by EBRD. EIB, the European Investment Bank, is providing 668 million euros of emergency financial support in terms of loans for infrastructure and reconstruction. IMF puts 1.4 billion of emergency financial assistance on US dollars, 1.4 billion on the table, and the World Bank promised $700 million US dollars of emergency financial assistance in form of loans, guarantees, and grants. OECD provides the accession process of Russia, which will be terminated. And finally, BIS is supporting sanctions against Russia. This is what we have right now.
Barbara, I have to interrupt.
Yes.
Barbara.
Yes.
I have to interrupt you because you went much over time, and because we are on this new platform
I'm done.
that works
I'm
well,
done with the numbers.
But okay. I didn't find a way to jump in, so I was not able to stop you. But
sorry, I'm done.
That's a smart way to continue talking, and thank you so much for doing that. You also went a bit beyond anticipating some of the issue we can discuss later. Good points. I didn't mention it. You did very good. It's the problem that we are experiencing with as well with the supply chains. The fact that Ukraine, that is an extraordinary rich country of commodities, raw material, underneath earth or above earth, is basically producing zero. I'll just give you an example of sunflower. Italy was a big consumer of sunflower, and now we're getting almost zero sunflower. Just to give you an example and how this is pushing, the demand high of many commodities and how pushing the prices. And of course, consumers around Europe and particularly in some other areas around the world are paying the price because there are obviously big consequences. I'm just thinking about Egypt asking the IMF for a line of credit in order to buy grain. But I also want to turn to Nataliya Melnyk. Nataliya is from Ukraine. Now she will tell us whether she's still in Ukraine, or likely she could leave Kyiv, where she's from. Nataliya works with the Bendukidze Free Market Center. Apology for my pronunciation. That's why I never read bios. That's a trick. And she's obviously from Kyiv, and she obviously a partner of the Free Market Roadshow. Now, Nataliya, the question, of course, is first, how are you doing? How your friends and relatives are doing? Hopefully, everyone is doing fine, although I understand all the pain and you have all our support, although we're here and fine and safe, and I know our are just words, but please accept our moral support at least. My first question is, what's the situation in Ukraine? It would be very stupid to say it's a devastating situation for the economics in Ukraine, but also how do you see right now the geopolitics changing around you?
So, hello, everyone. So, yeah, I am traditionally based in Kyiv, so is my organization, but now I made the decision to leave Kyiv for a little bit, hopefully. And I moved back to my hometown in Western Ukraine, just for the peace of mind of my parents. That's the main reason. My colleagues are actually all over Europe. And I guess during the pandemic, we kind of got used to working online. So fortunately, we are among those Ukrainians who are able to continue working. And well, that's one of the issues on top of the war going on in the country that we are trying to handle right now. Like you said, obviously, war has horrible effects on the economy, and not just because of the destruction that it brings. And we see a lot of destruction. I'm sure you have access to footage and pictures from, areas around Kyiv, from eastern Ukraine, from the south of Ukraine. Um, but when it all started, February 21st, a lot of people reacted with panic and with shock, and they packed their things and left. So even people from Western Ukraine opted to leave, go to Poland, first of all, and then probably further somewhere in Europe. And they had their reasons since the very first day Russia bombed locations all over the country. Even though traditionally you would assume that Western Ukraine is safer than all the other territories. But since locations in Western Ukraine were hit then, and they do get hit from time to time, not to cause destruction per se, but it's more to terrorize the local population and the internally displaced people fled to the Western Ukraine. And because of the uncertainty, because of certain level of panic and fear, a lot of people are not going back to work. Some of the companies are closing their offices or in the process of relocating or just doing it permanently. And people are not capable, in some cases, to go back to work because psychologically, it's very complicated to concentrate on anything except, the news, to see where the latest rocket hit, or how much destruction was done to their homes and things like that. So this is what our government is trying to put focus on, is trying to ask people to go back to work, to explain to them that it's very important to be making money, to be putting money back into the economy, to support our defenders who are doing everything they can on the front line. And you can actually see more places opening up, like cafes, restaurants, even some movie theaters in different locations, in the relatively safer locations. And sometimes it gives you an illusion of a peaceful life, but it's not very long lasting. So obviously we're also struggling with supply chain disruptions. Some of the things that we can't get, that we would normally get through ports, which right now are being blocked by the Russian Navy. And that's one of the reasons why this war is being felt in Africa right now, right? Because we are not able to export said grains, and like not to underestimate Ukraine, right? Ukraine feeds about 500 million people all over the world. So it's not only a big problem for Ukraine, it's a big problem for everyone. Well, what we can do and what we see businesses doing is looking for different suppliers, looking for other ways to bring, goods in and to export things. What we're extremely worried about is our agriculture and whether our farmers will be able to do their job. Fortunately, due to the weather, it got put off just a little bit because we still had freezing temperatures until very recently. But you probably also saw videos in the temporarily occupied region of Kherson, where farmers are not afraid of Russian soldiers that try to threaten them into staying at home. They just go out onto the fields because they know that they have a job to do, a very important one, especially now. So people try, like everyone is trying to do whatever they can, do some work, volunteer, help out with medical and humanitarian aid, especially when it comes to sourcing it, because for obvious reasons, everything that could have been bought in Ukraine has been bought already, and it's even getting more difficult to get things in Europe. So we have to look further. But every little thing helps, and you're trying to live with guilt of being safer than millions of other Ukrainians, and we're trying to cope with this guilt by working, day and night, work days and weekends, just to help make the suffering, just help decrease it as much as we can, right? Obviously, the Russians are the ones who have the most power when it comes to that. They just need to, leave the country, and that would be the end of the war. But we don't have the opportunity, the possibility to give up right now, because we're fighting for our country, for our home, and for our freedom and future.
Thank you so much, Nataliya. First of all, thank you for letting us know that you're doing great and you're safe. And thank you for providing a very rational and lucid picture of the current situation. And actually, you stress how important it is to keep doing what you usually do, obviously in terrible conditions, but how this is the foundation of freedom and the foundation, obviously, entrepreneurship and trade. I will definitely come back to you and take your time again for asking a more specific questions on what is happening around us in terms of geopolitics and how in Ukraine, obviously you are there, you're from there, how you feel at the moment about what's happening geopolitically around us. But let me turn for a moment to our third guest that has been already with us, and that's Prince Michael of Liechtenstein, who is the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Intelligence Service. So is one of the right experts in geopolitics. Karl, I would thank you first of all for being here with us and again with the team. What is happening in Europe? Because it's hard. We can take this from many perspectives, and all of us have different opinion. But if we look at the Western, what's happening to the West? And what is your take on the current situation that we are experiencing after 2 years of pandemic and now with this war in Ukraine?
I think it's looking at the situation geopolitically, and I might go, before I come to Europe, go a little bit back. And what strikes me, and this is an interesting picture, it struck me, I think there was, I don't know, 1992 or 1993, I've seen a television discussion between the then Austrian Chancellor, I forgot his name, and Archduke Otto of Habsburg, who was then still in the European Parliament. And Archduke Otto said very clearly, Russia is now weak, but we don't have to misuse, we have to use the situation of a weak Russia, but not misuse it and not offend it. And he said the other thing, it will come, it's an illusion, he said, that Russia will become a democratic country. That's an illusion. And he said after this Yeltsin era, stronger leaders will come in. And then he said there will be developing certainly a conflict between the US and the new Russia. He said it might take 20 years, but it will come. And he said simply, and then he said another thing, we have to say, Ukraine is a European country. We should get, and we should use this very short slot which we have to get Ukraine, even if it might not be economically ready, into the European Union. The Austrian chancellor treated him like an illusionist, etc. That all doesn't make any sense. But it was a very right observation. And what we see now is that also now Ukraine is suffering a conflict between the East and the West. Now, if we look at as it was in 2014, it is the same now. The West has no possibility for deterrence. And I think if we look at the point of deterrence, there are three things you have to do so that the deterrence can work. You have to be crystal clear, you have to be credible, and what you say has to be enforceable. Now, the second thing is the West, and that we know from game theory and also behavioral, when there is, let's say, a supranational or different national, you need some country or a person who takes a certain leadership. This would be President Biden, but President Biden is totally, he is weak, he is not consistent, he is not, I would say, either, it's a question, either his intelligence systems don't work or there's a lack of intelligence. So I don't know what it is. But if we see his statement, he is saying very harsh words he uses against the person of Putin, he uses against Russia, but then he utters things like, I never intended sanctions to deter Russia, just to apply pain. It doesn't make sense. Now, he said, the US said, okay, we will support Ukraine, but we will not give a security guarantee. I don't even want to talk about total indecisiveness in Germany. And I think the Ukrainian ambassador to Berlin is actually a very honest man, is very clearly. I don't know, Nataliya, whether he's related to you, but he has the same last name. And I think he's not diplomatic, but he says the right word. There is not sufficient support there. I think the two countries in Europe who are really supporting it are the United Kingdom and Poland. Now, we have this, but we still have this tension between East and West, between Russia and the West, and unfortunately there, Ukraine is suffering out of that. And the mentionings of Biden are not helpful. So, but I see a certain chance, and I see one country which is really useful is Turkey. And Turkey wants to get solutions. But unfortunately, it looks like, as this war is going to last, the West is too cautious because it needs courage to do that. And Washington, but also Europeans are so afraid of the nuclear power of Russia that they don't even reflect that Russia will, it is very unlikely that they will use their nuclear power. So they could be, they could also help, and I think some offensive weapons to Ukraine could actually shorten the war. Putin did grave miscalculations. He underestimated the bravery and the strength of the Ukrainians, and he overestimated his own armed forces. And I think it's a big shock to him that he sees that corruption was also very strong in the army. The unfortunately very grim picture that I'm afraid this will go on. I hope I'm wrong. I hope the ceasefire discussions and in Turkey will bring something without that unnecessary or too high concessions will have to be made. I think it was also quite wise that President Zelensky said, finally, it will be the people of Ukraine and of the regions of Ukraine who will have to decide on that, which I think is a wise move, does not fit into the normal habits of diplomacy, but I think a wise way of doing it. So I think the stronger the West and the more determined it will be in there, the shorter the war will be. But it needs this support. Sorry to be so pessimistic, but I think one has to be realistic and not work for the principle of hope and let the poor Ukrainians being there in a fight.
Thank you, Prince Mikhail, for your crystal clear, I would say, analysis. And well, I wouldn't say you're pessimistic. You are looking at the facts, and unfortunately, these are the facts right now. Good point on the role, the crucial role that Turkey is playing right now, and it seems going back some centuries where really Turkey was the bridge among two different worlds. Obviously, it was a totally diverse story back then. But you also underlined in your initial example, in your initial story, the fact that probably what was really missing in Ukraine, or at least in the negotiation from 2014 to today, was actually the European or a common voice of the European regions. I'm in fact, thank you, Prince, I'm going back to Barbara for a second round and probably the last one because since we're as usual running out of time, and probably time is actually the most important commodity right now. Barbara, you gave a perfect data picture, providing all the data. You mentioned, of course, the sanctions. You also mentioned, the fact that we are right now at shortage of in our supply chains, and we're paying an incredibly high cost. Luckily, it's not a high cost of lives as in Ukraine, but unfortunately, it's also an economic high cost that can have also consequences socially after the long pandemic. First of all, how do you see any solutions on that? And second, a question that I wanted to ask you before this event, do you think that sanctions are working or they risk to undermine European economy, favoring other economies that are not playing or applying the sanctions and they're doing business like ordinary business with Russia as nothing is happening?
As an economist, I may answer right away yes and no on the one hand, and on the other hand, we know from the long history of sanctions that in most of the times sanctions have not worked, and the results that they should have achieved were not there. And that we have also seen that if you put sanctions on a country, that it's the poorest people who suffer usually, and they suffer from the effects of the sanctions. It hits the wrong people. But we have also seen in many places that sanctions hit those in the long run who put them or who announced them as well. So it's a two-sided sword, and one has to be very careful with that. Of course, we have seen right now certain big media hits that villas, castles, yachts have been obtained, and but this is just the top of the iceberg with regards to the sanctions. There is much more behind, and what is very important in both countries, whether it's Ukraine and whether it's Russia, there will be a day after. And on the one hand, we have to rebuild the infrastructure and the economy. And on the other hand, we will probably, I don't know, have to collaborate, work with others. There are geopolitical tensions that Prince Michael has already mentioned. I mean, there are blocks, the US, Russia, China. Europe is a small part in the game, one thing. And having said that, what we see because of the shortages, especially of energy and the important supplies in raw materials, and you mentioned agriculture as well, prices will definitely go up all around the world, but will also go up in Europe. And it's not only the people in the Middle East or in Africa that will feel and that will suffer from no grain, from the high grain prices, but it's also Western Europe. It's our industry that will suffer from the high energy prices. And that is a danger. And I mentioned inflation at the very beginning, and with that I will stop right now. So that we also have to see at all those things. So sanctions are a two-sided sword, and if we look into the history of it, it has not brought the results that were desired.
Thank you, Barbara. Nataliya, coming to you again, taking your time. You mentioned the situation right now in Ukraine, but politically, how do you see the world is moving around you, and how you perceive it? Besides Russia, and we understand, obviously, not just the feelings, but also the type of relationship that you have and you have built in time. But how do you see the West particularly behaving, but also other countries that are ignoring the sanctions and ignoring the attempt to block the tyranny and the invasion of Ukraine, and are, keeping on doing business with Russia?
So from our perspective, let's say the collective West was first caught completely off guard, and later started acting in a very reactionary manner with a pretty significant lag as to what was going on in the country. And even though we see that the reaction is, the speed of reaction is increasing right now, but what our diplomats are doing and what our civil society is doing is trying to push for more sanctions, trying to come up with new ways to hit the Russian economy and Russian people for several reasons. We do believe in collective responsibility, and we do believe that the majority of Russians share responsibility for what's going on in Ukraine, for what Russia is doing in Ukraine, because it's not Putin that's bombing, killing, destroying, raping, and stealing. And it's not innocent Russian boys who are being sent here, unknowingly to them. So basically, we are going against the good Russians narrative. And doing what we can to make sure that no one is comparing what Ukrainians are going through to what Russians are going through under the sanctions, because they are not comparable at all. And we want to make sure that our Western partners do not fall for it, because we understand, like Prince Michael said absolutely correctly, it will last for longer, this war, and there is an added threat of our allies starting to regret some of the sanctions, or wanting to scale them down, or even remove some of them instead of more countries joining in, or just, you know, the world in general getting tired of talking about the war in Ukraine. You know, it's not a very positive topic to discuss, and how, you know, much longer can you be looking at pictures of dead children and pregnant women and things like that. So the loss of interest is a threat, and we, from our side, we need to be working on having more allies on our side. But obviously, we do see countries who might be condemning what Russia is doing, but just, you know, stopping at the word level. They're not actually doing anything to make it stop. And we see that for a lot of them, cheap oil and gas is more important than Ukrainians' lives, right? Because they're dealing with their own issues. And like you said, Russia is willing to decrease these prices because of a little bit of desperation. For example, Hungary, right? So Hungary is one of the stronger, let's say, Russian allies in Europe, and it's trying to not support Russia openly, but at the same time, it's not doing a lot of the things it should be doing. But, you know, it's up to the Hungarian people, and you know, them making their own conclusions about their own government. We also see that like problems arising with the indecision that's in Germany, right? So even though they said that they would finally allow German weapons to be sold and sent to Ukraine, they are doing everything they can to delay this process. So like even with countries who are trying to do something to support us, they are doing it, I think, with a lot of regard to what Putin might think of them or what Putin might do in response. And this is very dangerous to them as well as Ukraine, because if Ukraine is not able to defend itself and win this war, Russia will not stop at Ukraine. And we would be talking about Russia looking at Moldova, at Poland, and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, probably Georgia again. So this is just the beginning. And I think that if we want it to stop, you know, at Ukraine, you know, Ukraine is a barrier of sorts, then a lot more needs to be done. And because the cost of this war for Russia needs to be as high as possible. Maybe this will make Russian people look at the situation differently, but I guess actually the chances are pretty slim, because based on the latest surveys, 73% of Russians support Putin. That's an increase of 12% compared to January. So basically, since the war started, the support has increased, and 69% of Russians believe that Russia is headed the right way. So even with all of the sanctions, right? So what we're facing here, in the case of Russia, under the sanctions, is that it will close up. It will, like Barbara said, try to be more self-sufficient, but at the same time, hungrier and angrier, and which will make Russia as a country even more dangerous. So these are the things that should be taken into account when handling Putin and handling Russia in this situation.
Thank you, Natalia, and apologize because, again, there's a problem with my internet, or it seems with the platform somewhere, like last time, where we tried to fix it, worked well till now, but you see that my voice comes before my image, so that's pretty disturbing for you guys, but also for me, because I see myself in the past. Natalia, thank you so much. Prince, I'm coming back to you for last question before the usual goodbyes. You said you're pessimistic, and this is about the consequences for Europe. What are the consequences for Europe, and what can Europe do to avoid some of these consequences? If we think about supply chains, because one of the statements I made a few weeks ago in a conference was, we depend for much of what we import from, obviously, other countries, and these countries are definitely not aligned with us right now. So we really have to buy commodities from them, and they don't listen to us.
Do you hear me? I don't hear you anymore. Hello? Yeah, it was stopped.
Yeah,
But
could you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you again, yeah.
Yes, my question was, since the topic of today is the consequences of Europe, and you said you're very pessimistic, how can Europe avoid its consequences? As we realized with the pandemic and with the war in Ukraine, that we, for our wealth, we depend too much or very much from commodities that are coming from countries that no longer listen to us. The
I don't
question
hear
is,
you.
I'm sorry if the image is...
Yeah, I think I understand it. It's sort of the consequences for Europe. And I think it's it will need a change of thinking. The European leadership was a good weather leadership, and they never thought about using strength, making provisions, looking for alternatives, etc. So this is a problem, and I think we have to see one thing in Europe. We will have to live with Russia. Russia is there, and Russia is a fact. But Russia is also thinking differently. We always put our thinking over to Russia. We have an illusion in Russia that we have an illusion in Europe that Russia might become sort of a peaceful democracy on European system, and then we talk about European values, which is not very clear what it is, and so on. We have to acknowledge that Russia will probably always have a strong leadership. Russia is also offended and feels basically violated by the West. This are strong. They will have a strong leadership. So I think the only answer to a military threat is to have a military deterrence. I don't think we will solve it only by sanctions, and it looks like that I'm warmongering there, but I think if in 2014 I've said, if instead of the sanctions, for instance, the different countries in Europe would have really spent more money on defense and on arms, that would have been a very strong sign to Moscow. Okay, you in Moscow, you do what you want in your country, but don't touch any of our members, but also of our, let's say, of other independent countries. Just keep inside inside your borders, and this rule was neglected because we will stay dependent on trade with Russia, and also if we are strong enough, we can have trade, and we can have an interesting trade, and be quiet. It would be even also important for Ukraine to be able to trade with Russia because it is an important member. So the consequences, I think, will be hard, and I think it will be you know, this question, Germany needs the gas. It's true. It should not take it from Russia, but it can't. Now they make sort of a very strange fight whether it should be paid in dollars or euros or rubles, which has actually no real importance. I think we need a lot more determination. It might come slowly, but unfortunately it's not enough. And I think when Nataliya said that actions in the West were more reactionary than strong, I think this was a very nice way of putting it. So we will get inflation, we will have problems not only on the energy side, also Europe will have it on the food side. So it will not only touch, but I think we have to see as we have to prepare for also quite a strong military answer. That means at the moment only also being ready to send offensive weapons to Ukraine, because at the moment I don't think anybody will decide to send soldiers.
Thank you so much, Prince Michael of Liechtenstein, for this, I would say, very strong but also pragmatic analysis. Hopefully things will be sorted out differently, but as you said, that could be the way. I want to thank you very much for being here with us. I want to thank Nataliya for being here with us, considering the situation, and really I want all of you and all of us here to wish her the best luck, and to the people of Ukraine, and hoping that this conflict will end as soon as possible, and Ukraine can go back in to where it was before, toward prosperity. And then obviously, so Nataliya, all the best and my biggest hug. And then obviously I want to thank Barbara, if we are here, is also thanks to Barbara for the incredible effort of the Austrian economics, of Competere as well, and all the team in Vienna that is allowing us and helping us to be here. Again, apologies for the problem, for the internet problem. Otherwise, I wish everybody a good evening or a good rest of the day, and we see next month with another Austrian Economics Monthly. Thank you so much, and God bless you.